Welcome again, everybody, to the 5th webinar of our series, Teaching Fluency Across NRS Levels. If we haven't met, I'm Marn Frank. I'm doing this series as an Atlas consultant after retiring in July. I also have an encore gig as a reading skills tutor, which has been a wonderful experience for me to put into practice all that I had been telling people about for years. Joining me is Rob Podlasek, a colleague and a friend.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob. I'm the training director for Literacy Minnesota, sitting here realizing that I have misunderstood what retired meant my entire life. Apparently, I guess you don't get to stop working after you retire, so have to process this. But I've been involved working with Marn and with Christine and with Atlas since we started the STAR project and the EBRI initiative many years ago, because we wanted to make sure that the training that I provide for volunteers aligns with the training that Atlas provides for teachers. And so I've been on that team since the inception. And Fluency is one of those places where it's easy to align efforts because there's a delightfully finite number of fluency activities that teachers tend to do. And so it's easy to train volunteers to do that. Also find that fluency is a labor-intensive strategy. It's possible for a teacher to do vocabulary as a full group activity, but for fluency, you often want to break it up into reading groups, and so volunteers become a really valuable resource. And I know when we started emphasizing reading fluency, the demand for volunteers kind of crept up, and really encourage you, if you're doing reading fluency, to think about bringing volunteers in your class to provide the support needed. Thanks.
And I think those volunteers receive many rewards from doing fluency groups. There's typically an excellent response from students to have a proficient reader explicitly showing them how the English language is read for understanding. A quick reminder that the next webinar is on May 20th, same time, same place. The topic being teaching comprehension skills across NRS levels. And my co-presenter will be Penny Brown, who has spent many, many years focused on comprehension with her ABE and GED students. An important feature of this series is a participant folder where prior to each webinar, I upload documents across all the years of STAR and EBRI that are relevant to the topic of that webinar. So you can see the ones newly uploaded are all focused on fluency. Several of them, Rob and I worked together on back and forth to make it relevant not only for teachers, but for volunteers. So Christine will put that link in the chat box, and then being that you have it, you can come and go as you want and download whatever documents you prefer. Many are, if not all, in PDF form, and you can share them with other teachers in your program. What we intend to focus on over the next hour and a half is the evidence for teaching fluency, mostly to encourage you to consider it because it does have great value for reading instruction. So I think it's important to know the why behind fluency. We'll listen to some samples of good, fair, and oral reading. That is involved in assessing, but also planning for reading instruction. And then we'll try to clearly explain what does good, fair, and poor mean for instruction. We'll walk you through some fluency routines or techniques, beginning with ideal and then moving into what's real for your classroom. And then I'll share another document of practitioner recommended fluency resources. It's very robust, that was put together last year by STAR teachers. So it's what they have found to be tried and true, actually for all 4 reading components, not just for fluency. So it's a very valuable document for how do I do this. And over the years, the number of resources has just ballooned. We started with so little at the beginning of STAR in 2009, 2010. So for most of the components, you do not have to create any of your materials. So much is accessible and free. Well, that's our plan. So we would like to ask you, check in with you as to what you want or need to learn about fluency. So if you're comfortable, put your answer in the chat box and we'll review it to make sure that everyone is heard. Okay, Martha wants to know which practices have the most bang for the buck. And I'm assuming you mean techniques, and hopefully we can answer that. A lot of the impact depends on the level of the readers. Okay. Time and effort. Like the other components, fluency lessons tend to be short, 15 to 30 minutes. So as long as they're regular, they can be short. Okay, Danielle asks a question that hopefully the outline of each routine will answer. Okay, Amy asks about the order. Carrie's, I'm confident we'll be able to answer. In terms of the order, if I forget to say this, it's recommended that you use one fluency technique at a time so that students don't have to be concerned about a new routine, but are comfortable with a learned routine. Anything else? Well, if we don't answer your question, be sure to raise it again, and either Rob or both of us or Christine can join in too. We'll provide you with answers. The evidence that I'm going to share comes from this book. It's thick. It's actually more like a textbook from 2012, which might seem like a long time ago, and it is. But this book was so important at its time and even now, because it was the first book to consider ELLs along with native English speakers. So they looked at research from both of those populations to come up with options for practice and research. And I will read both of these paragraphs to you so that you can absorb them. Developing fluency is important because the human mind is limited in its capacity to carry out many cognitive processes at once. When word and sentence reading become automatic, readers can concentrate more fully on creating meaning from text. So in other words, if readers are too focused on getting the print off the page, it's very easy to lose meaning. So it's important to help them be automatic and proficient, not only at the word and sentence level, but also with paragraphs. This quote aligns with an interrelationship that we talked about at meeting 1, that between fluency and comprehension. Guided repeated reading, where readers are supported by a proficient English speaker, has generally led to moderate increases in fluency, accuracy, and sometimes comprehension for good and poor readers. Although I can't argue with this evidence or the work that went behind it, anecdotally, I think, again, there is a very strong relationship between fluency and comprehension. A number of teachers told me over the years that that seemed to be the missing piece for some of their readers. They had the alphabetics, they had the vocabulary, but reading for meaning is what turned the page for those readers. I really like this quote from Timothy Razinski, where he says reading fluency forms a bridge from decoding to comprehension. It's a long bridge, but definitely it's an important bridge. We have evidence from the college and career reading foundational skills also. RF4 specifically talks about fluency, where students learn to read with sufficient, not perfect, accuracy and fluency to support comprehension. Atlas has added a few sub-skills to this. We want to recognize that for basic literacy students, it's important that they become fluent with letter names, sounds, and basic words before being ready for text. We also want to recognize the value of emergent texts with photos or pictures that offer wonderful cues for basic students and reading. When moving into grade level text, it's also important to include prose and poetry so that students can read all kinds of text with accuracy at an appropriate rate with expression over multiple or successive readings. And then finally, having the fluency to recognize when something doesn't make sense and fixing it or rereading in order to understand. Rob is going to talk about the reading fluency dimensions that are interrelated and equally important.
All right, thanks, Marn. Marn shared her favorite fluency quote. I'll share mine, which is, the goal of reading fluency isn't fluency, it's comprehension. And I think I may have made that quote up, but I like it because sometimes we get really hung up on how does it sound? And that's not the point. It's always going back to, it's a means to an end, not the end itself. And so you always have to analyze everything around fluency with how is it impacting comprehension? And if it impacts it positively, then it's a good thing. If it impacts it negatively, that's a bad thing. So on the screen are the three dimensions of fluency: accuracy, rate, and prosody, along with some standards, I guess. So the first one is accuracy, getting the words right. If it says dog, the student doesn't read dig or cat. And you can see the numbers 90 to 95%. And there's a range there. If you are reading in a language that's your first language, you can have lower accuracy than if you're reading in a second language and still understand what you're reading. If you're reading content that you're very familiar with, you can have lower accuracy than if you're reading content you're very familiar with. But the important thing, and I always tell volunteers this, it doesn't have to be 100%. None of us have 100% accuracy when we read. We don't need it because we just need enough accuracy to get to comprehension. And sometimes there are questions about what's accurate, what's not accurate. If the student reads the word well enough so they understand what it means, that's accurate. So if they pronounce it differently, but they know what it means, that's not a fluency error. That's a pronunciation difference, and you may choose to work on that at a different part of the lesson. If the word is stopped and they say stopped, chances are they know what that word means. So it's not a reading fluency issue, it's a grammar issue or a pronunciation issue. So again, really thinking about reading fluency as reading fluency and what constitutes a reading fluency accuracy error. The second is rate, and that is how fast should you be able to read. And for kids, we have these grade level standards. A third grader should be able to read this many words per minute, and a fourth grader should be able to read this many words per minute. We really don't know how fast a 25-year-old man from St. Cloud should be able to read. So those grade levels are really not that useful. So I like the appropriate speed that supports understanding, not too slow, not too fast. And again, that will vary what you're reading. If you're reading something that you're very familiar with, then you can read a lot faster than if you're reading new, unfamiliar content. And so there's no magical number. I think for most students, the goal is to get them to read a little bit more quickly because they tend to struggle. And so getting that speed up is often what we're working on. But I work with students that the faster the better. It's not a race, and the sweet spot is, do you understand what you're reading or don't you understand what you're reading? And then the third part is that prosody. How does it sound? Reading the text smoothly and meaningful phrases and with some expression. And again, this is a place where the goal of fluency isn't fluency, it's comprehension. You can get a student who reads something absolutely beautifully and has no comprehension. And you can have a student who reads something, you're like, well, that didn't sound great, but there still might be comprehension. And so really recognizing that good prosody impacts comprehension, but don't worry too much about the performance aspect. And really become aware that every student kind of has a different level of prosody, and they can still be fluent. If you put a reading passage in front of me and in front of James Earl Jones, I guarantee that it will sound a lot better when he reads it, but we still might have the same level of understanding. So again, you always have to think about the individual students. All right, I think we're back to Marn.
Thanks, Rob. In terms of accuracy, what's made sense to me is a word is considered an error when it changes the meaning of the phrase or sentence. So when it's wrong enough to change the meaning, that would be considered an error. Rob talked about words correct per minute, and the reason, two reasons, in addition to what he said, that it's not appropriate to use with adults is that the norms are based on children. So again, that's not easy to apply to adults. And being timed often makes adult students nervous. And so that can really mess up their accuracy because they're reading too fast. Children might see it as a game, but that's not a typical adult reaction to being timed. And the expression piece is often the last to develop. If you think about any musical instrument that you've played, you learn the notes, that's the accuracy. You put the notes into music, but you might still be so concentrated on getting it right that the expression doesn't happen until you've achieved that automaticity. We're going to listen to and watch 3 video clips of 3 readers from Minneapolis Adult Education. Rod did the videos, correct, and edited them more than once. They are 3 students at different levels who were actually going through assessment. So Furman, he started at level 6. He did very well. Then Krista presented level 7. He also did very well. So we're going to listen to level 8. And as you're listening, think about those dimensions, and then I will share my impression of those dimensions for Furman and what that means instructionally.
This is a story to learn more about mail order shopping. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Jeannie and Kim had been shopping for equipment for their camping trip. For several days, they had been going from store to store looking for things they needed. Shopping was taking a long time and was very inconvenient. Their neighbor said that he had been shopping by sending the things through a mail order catalog for years. Jean
Yep.
Jean said that he had heard about mail order shopping, but he was worried about getting their money back if something was wrong with the purchase. When the neighbor told Jean and Kim that the store offered a refund warranty, they asked him if they could borrow his catalog.
Okay, I'm having trouble getting out of the video this time.
Could you go ahead and share your screen again?
Okay.
Try closing the PowerPoint and starting up again on the next slide.
And I've got my slide deck ready, Marn, if you want me to jump to that.
Okay. I can't seem to get out of where I am.
I think if you hit escape. And are you on and minimize your screen so that it's not on full screen? Christine, why don't you go ahead and pull them up and share your slides, and then Marn can work on it and see, but we can keep going. Okay, Marn, the slides are up if you want to just continue.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody.
It's fine.
That just isn't how it's worked in the past. So when I listen to Furman, and I've listened to him many, many times, I hear good accuracy, good rate, good prosody, and even some expression. Again, it's not perfect, but it's good enough. So in terms of instruction,
I think there's an echo going on.
yeah, the sound is really, okay, that's better.
Yeah.
In terms of instruction, this means that he has mastery at level 6, 7, and 8. So text that would be slightly challenging would be at grade equivalent 9 to 10. And I also mentioned 8 because what he read was fiction. And so if he's struggling with nonfiction at grade equivalent 9 to 10, struggling too much, you might want to go back and offer 8. Any questions on that?
Marn, Keith had a question. He said the proctor in that video, what was she focusing on? All 3 aspects or maybe accuracy?
She was focusing on all 3, but she was marking the word errors as a way to look at fluency. So she was actually crossing off words that were changing the meaning. She might have been marking where he was pausing, but really the only error was in the word gene, the name. And you wouldn't count that as wrong because that is not dramatically going to change the meaning. And she offered the correction to him. Okay, the second student is Ahmed. And Ahmed started at level 4, and he did quite well with level 4. So we're going to listen to level 5. And again, think about those 3 dimensions, and then I'll give you my impression.
We'll do the next one. This is a passage about how deer can be a problem.
Bamba is a children's story that was made into a Walt Disney movies. In the story, Bambi is a baby deer who play with other baby forest animal. When Bambi is almost growing, a hunter shoots Bambi a mother, and Bambi goes to the life with his father. In real life, deer have caused many car crashed when they try to cross the road. This is especially true at night. When driver cannot see it as well, people have been hurt and some have died because of those car crash. If too many deer live in an area, it can cause a problem. Besides causing the car crash, they can also cause property damage. They eat people's plants and garden. Having too many deer in an area is not good for either people or the deer. Too many deer is one reason states allow hunters to get a license to shoot deer.
So my impression of Ahmed is that the accuracy was still there. It was still within that 90 to 95%, maybe a little less, but still good enough. However, what was breaking down for him was the rate and the prosody. So his rate was slow. It was also at times word by word. And he was reading in a very monotone way. The chunking was not always even, and there really wasn't any expression. So he doesn't need work at level 4. He does need work at grade equivalent 5 to 6. In fact, when he was presented with 6, he struggled immensely. There were several words used repeatedly in the passage that he could not get off the page correctly. So selecting text for Ahmed at 5 to 6 would have the most bang for its buck to answer that question. Any questions on that? Let's move to the next slide. Sample 3 is Kalia, another non-native English speaker. She was presented with level 1, and that was challenging for her, but she was able to get through it. So we're going to listen to level 2 to see how she manages grade equivalent 2 passages.
Another one, okay? This is a story about how a boy or a man, we're not sure, helps someone.
Okay. Some buys a new newspaper. Some stopped to ask Mr. Kai if she needed anything for the store. She was very old. Some liked to help her. She asked him to buy her a newspaper. Some went to the store. The store wasn't closed. Some walked for a long time to another store. He asked for a newspaper. One was folded and put into his bag. Some give Miss Kay the paper. She said, "Oh, Sam, you are so good. I haven't seen a paper written in Greek of months." Sam was surprised, but he just said, "You are very welcome, Mr. Key."
So Kalia is really struggling with level 2. It's quite labored. So in my opinion, all 3 of those dimensions have broken down. And so you would not want to offer her anything beyond grade equivalent 1 to 2. And even at those low levels, she would need pretty high support in order to improve her fluency and her confidence. Any questions on Kalia? If you don't have the means or the time to assess fluency, what you can do is look at the Tabor-Casas grade equivalent. And I wouldn't start above that level for fluency. I would start below. And it's a range. So because of the differences in how text is identified as grade equivalents, you don't want to focus on one grade equivalent, but rather think about it as a range, and it can be a range of 2. It can even be a range of 3. And then by thinking about fluency needs as ranges, you're better able to group students into similar ranges, not separate groups for each grade equivalent, but small groups within a manageable range of 2 to 3. No questions? Next slide. So, when thinking about your own students, what are their needs? Is it 1 or 2 of the dimensions, or all 3? Please put your answers in the chat box. I see 2 all 3s. More all 3. Christine gives a good answer that usually all three, depending on the level of the text. Harder text, the focus is on accuracy to begin with, and then rate and prosody. Okay, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. If you don't have accuracy, it's really hard to read at an appropriate rate. And with prosody, as you found out with Kalia.
Martin, there was a question that snuck by from Keith, and that is, by support, do you mean modeling the reading?
Yes, modeling the reading and guiding the reading. So at first modeling how it should sound like, and then giving students a chance to practice that and being there for them to either offer correction or compliments or feedback. Okay, next slide. So here's what the evidence says about instruction. And again, this is ideal. Ideal has been more difficult over the past couple of years during the pandemic, sometimes impossible to achieve because of all those shifts happening from day to day, week to week. Anyway, fluency instruction, like the other four components, should be scaffolded. And I think we emphasized that when we shared what Atlas had added to Reading Foundational Skill 4, that you can progress from letter, sound, word readings to text readings, where you're focused on all three dimensions. And then moving from shorter text to longer, mostly nonfiction text readings. It should be routine. Similarly leveled groups, like I described earlier, meet 1 to 3 times a week with a proficient English speaker, reading aloud for 15 to 30 minutes a day, and participate in comprehension checking. So depending on how often you meet, it could be 1 passage a week, it could be 1 passage a day. That depends on how students progress in their fluency along with their confidence. And then to keep that fluency to comprehension interrelationship going, a good strategy is to stop and check their understanding. And if they're understanding, that's another clue that they might be ready for another passage or even a higher level. We always want reading instruction to be explicit, where you're focusing on repeated oral readings with modeling, like Keith asked about, and then transitioning to guided practice, where you're still present for them, and then applying it to a variety of text lengths, types, and structures. Having students reread a passage silently is also application, and checking comprehension is another example of application. Christine, can you answer the question, why focus on nonfiction?
I can try. I know that that sometimes students, or many times, students are more familiar with structures of fiction, such as the story structure, and I see that can impact their fluency a little bit, whereas they might be a little bit smoother reading that particular structure. Nonfiction, there tends to be more academic vocabulary words, different kinds of sentence structures, content that they're very unfamiliar with. And so I, much like when you get into comprehension, I like to check them on both fiction and nonfiction, because the differences due to the differences in text can definitely show up.
Christine, isn't there a recommendation from the standards that it be 50-50 for lower levels and then 25-75 at higher levels? Am I making that up?
No,
or-
you're definitely not making that up. And and one thing to take into consideration with when talking about percentages is that's across the course of all of their instruction. So certainly if they are, so for example, my pre-GED students, we might be working on literature, but that's because I know that in a pullout group, they're working on nonfiction in science and maybe working on some in social studies. So, but definitely on the lower end, there's more of that fiction. And as students gain in ability, the focus on nonfiction becomes much greater.
Thank you for all the excellent questions. Any others? Next slide. So here is a routine, a very adaptable routine for basic literacy students. So again, you might need to focus on the Roman alphabet letters. So for fluency, you would be trying to build their accuracy of naming them or identifying them, like pointing to them on a grid or a chart, and out of order. So you're making it more challenging by presenting them out of order. They can also work on hearing and saying the primary sounds for the 26 letters. So that would be 21 single consonant and the 5 short vowel patterns. So building their accuracy with seeing the letter and knowing the sound. It's also important to build accuracy with word families, words that are formed by those 26 letters, and then sight or high frequency words, because they will appear within sentences, phrases and sentences, and they kind of hold those words together into meaningful content. You can also build accuracy with those keywords from language instruction. And then when students are ready, scaffolding to phrases, sentences, or short paragraphs. And they don't have to include the top words. That's near impossible unless you want to create your own phrases and sentences. What's more important here is moving away from the smaller units of letters and sounds and words into text. Next slide. For ESL 1 to 2, it's similar, except you're moving away from those single sounds into consonant beginning and ending blends, digraphs, the many, many vowel teams, the vowel R and vowel L teams, and then those less predictable letter sound patterns. So as I've mentioned before, we have 26 letters. We have 44 to 45 sound patterns, but then we have over 120 spellings. So the spellings are what makes alphabetics less predictable, all those different spellings. Again, bring in those sight, high frequency words, or word family lists, keywords from language instruction, and phrases, sentences, or longer paragraphs. Next slide. Well, let's take a break from all the content And we'll be back in 5 minutes to go through routines and techniques that cross the other levels. Okay, welcome back, everybody. And Rob is going to talk us through the modeled reading routine.
All right, thanks. Welcome back, everyone. So as I said earlier, there's a finite number of fluency strategies or routines out there, and they haven't invented a new one in a long time. So I'm guessing the strategies we're going to talk about you're familiar with, you may have used, but we want to go over them and model them and to give people a chance to provide some feedback on their experiences with them. And the first one is providing that modeled reading so that students get a chance to hear what good fluent reading sounds like. And Danielle asked earlier, how much time should you spend modeling reading versus them reading to you? I don't know if there's a magical number there, but I don't think we do enough modeled reading because we're so excited to get the students practicing on their own that they only hear their own, not very fluent reading, or their classmates not very fluent reading. So any opportunity you can provide for them to hear what fluent reading sounds like is great. And so doing a simple modeled reading routine is great, a great way to let them hear what fluent reading sounds like and to get them to analyze those components of fluent reading. So as you see on the screen, number one, just picking a text that's interesting. And this is a nice one because we're not having to worry about grade level equivalent. We're worrying about interesting and something that the students can understand. And so this is a great way to bring in high interest material, authentic texts that have longer sentences than the stuff in the textbooks sometimes do. So really focus on interesting and content the student is familiar with or able to understand. And then the teacher is going to read aloud with a good fluency. So not perfect fluency. You don't have to be James Earl Jones when you do this activity. You just want to model good fluency. And then after you've done that, ask the students what you did well so they can think about those pieces. What is fluent reading? And they can come up with these. You can provide them for them if they're struggling with them or not familiar with them, but just get them to do that metacognition to think about what is good reading? What am I trying to do when I do this on my own? And then the last thing, number 5, and we're going to include this in all of the routines, is kick it back into a little bit of comprehension. Again, the goal of fluency isn't fluency, it's comprehension. Fluency is a bridge to comprehension. So you always want to go back and do a little bit of comprehension questioning. I'd caution you against turning it into a comprehension lesson and getting too deep into the questions, but just a couple to get them remembering, oh yeah, it has to do with, do I understand what's going on? Okay. So go to the next slide, Christine.
Rob, can I ask for clarification?
Sure.
This is an introduction to fluency, right? So
Sure.
Before you're starting a series of fluency lessons or when you have new students join the groupings, is that the purpose, is to kind of build buy-in
Well, I think the first time you do it, yes, and you need to explain what the components of fluency are and so forth. But then sometimes it's the first pass you do when you're reading a text as a class, I think. Sometimes you'll model it for them before you move on to the other activities. So again, the two-part, one to introduce the concept of fluency, and then just to give them another example of this is what fluent reading sounds like, because I just don't think they get enough of that in classes. Right. So we're going to do a little modeling here, and we tried to get James Earl Jones to come and do this, but he was busy. So you got stuck with me. So I'm going to read a passage, and remember, I'm going to do a good enough job of reading this passage. And then what I would like you to do is think about, how did I read this well? And then what does good fluency sound like? And I'm going to make Christine very happy here. I've chosen 6-way paragraphs, which I know was one of her favorite texts. So do this in her honor. All right. No chance to dream. The thought of not sleeping for 24 hours or more is not a pleasant one for most people. The amount of sleep that each person needs varies. In general, each of us needs about 8 hours of sleep each day to keep our bodies healthy and happy. Some people, however, can get by with just a few hours of sleep at night. It doesn't matter when or how much a person sleeps, but everyone needs some rest to stay alive. Few doctors would have thought that there might be an exception to this. Sleep, after all, is a very basic need. But a man named Al Herpin turned out to be a real exception, for supposedly he never slept. So I'll ask you students, what did I do to read that passage well? Or what does good fluency sound like? What are some of the things that you noticed I did? Type them in the chat. So I paid attention to the punctuation. I got the words correct, or at least most of the words correct. I paused, and sometimes I paused at a period, and sometimes I paused at a comma, but sometimes I paused because we just know I pause at the end of those 3 words because that makes sense. And so by chunking those words together, it helps me understand. Okay. My voice went up and down. Again, not James Earl Jones quality inflection, but good enough for today and good enough for a normal reader. Okay, so good. So that's the idea. You model, and then you can ask them what you did. If you're doing this with lower level English language learners who don't have this language, you don't need to have the follow-up discussion, but you know in their heads, they're noticing what you're doing. All right, Marn, add things or move on to the next strategy. Oh, you're muted.
You know, we all do that. I think we learn, but we all do it.
Keith said they do notice, and there's a delightful video of Vicky Estrom doing this with students, and they come out all the things that you guys noticed. And even without being prompted about what they are, they could pull it out. So they notice. They might not have words for it, but they notice.
Yeah.
And Marn, I muted myself so many times on the IET Institute yesterday, I can't even tell you. So no worries at all.
I was listening so carefully to Rob reading that I completely forgot my next step. All right. Echo reading is a routine that provides the highest level of support. So this would be a good one for students like Kalia, who are reading at grade equivalent 1 to 2, or readers who have the accuracy, they can read the words, but they don't know how to put those words into meaningful chunks. Or readers that lack confidence. This is a really good way to build their confidence. What you give them is correct reading of every, or proficient reading of every word, phrase, sentence, and paragraph. So the teacher selects a passage that is appropriate for the group, that's within their grade equivalent range. The teacher reads the title and then by phrases or sentences. And you can skip the phrases part and go directly to sentences. It depends again on the needs and confidence of the readers. Then students repeat or echo all modeled phrases and sentences, trying to imitate the accuracy rate in prosody. If it's a group, only the teacher or the tutor provides quick corrections of misread words or phrases. Other students do not. And that needs to be clarified before the group begins. That in all fairness, only the teacher provides corrections. Then to make sure students aren't just parroting what they're hearing and hanging on to through their oral memory, then you also do an echo of the paragraphs. So the teacher reads aloud the entire first paragraphs and students echo, and then that's repeated for the remaining paragraphs. Again, if there's time, you can stop and ask a few 6W questions just to make sure that they are understanding. And then after enough modeled readings, you can assign partner or silent rereadings. And by that point, they should all have the confidence to do so comfortably. Next slide. This is an example of a ReadWorks passage at kindergarten level. And what I did is I put slashes between the phrases to show you how you can do that. Now, you might not disagree with my phrasing, and that's okay, as long as the phrase carries meaning. So I use echo with both of my elementary students. I go phrase by phrase with my second grader and sentence by sentence with the fifth grader. So if I were doing this with the second grader, we would always start phrase by phrase. In fact, what we do first is we have a copy of the text and I pre-phrased it. And so I read it by phrase and then she marks on her passage. She will not do it any other way because she really struggles with reading and lacks confidence, except that confidence is growing with a combination of phrase, sentence, and paragraph echo reading. So I would read taking photos and she would reread taking photos. Can be fun. Can be fun with more expression. We do phrase by phrase maybe 3 times, but then it's really necessary to scaffold to sentences because phrase by phrase is just naturally not very smooth. So it's really important that I build her confidence enough to go sentence by sentence. And that sounds like real reading rather than chunk reading. And then when she's brave enough, we move to the paragraphs. And she always knows the answers to the questions orally, not necessarily in print, but orally after using echo reading. The fifth grader, if I give him a choice, and I always do, you want to do choral, collaborative, or echo, he often picks echo, which surprises me every time. But again, it's what he feels most comfortable with. Any questions on echo? Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, it's about 120 different spellings. I think I counted 123, but I didn't necessarily trust myself enough to land on that number, so about 120. Next slide.
And back to me, and only Marn would count the number of spellings, so thank you for doing that research. So next strategy we'll talk about is repeated reading, and it's the idea that practice makes perfect, but practice with feedback makes perfect. And so in this strategy, you'll choose a text passage at the appropriate level or range. So you really want to pick something that's at the student's reading level. And then you'll have the student read it out loud, cold. And then you'll provide some feedback, and the student will provide some feedback about their own reading, about what they did well, what they struggled with, and what they could work on. So you might say, well, you know, maybe you could read a little bit more quickly. Maybe you could read a little bit more smoothly. Maybe you could pause more at the punctuation. Maybe you could focus more on the chunking. Maybe you could work on getting more inflection into what you're reading. So whatever seems appropriate. Again, it's great if the student can identify what they feel needs to work on. We know what our mistakes are sometimes, so the students can identify it. And then you're going to provide a model of what you've just talked about. So you can either reread that same text and the student can practice that same text, or if you have access to material or texts that are very, very similar, same level, same structures, things like that, then you can use that. And you're going to model reading with the right speed, reading with more smoothness, reading with greater inflection, reading with more chunking, so that the students can hear that. And then they get a chance to practice it. And I always think about this when I think about piano lessons. I would play a song for my instructor. She would listen to it. She'd give me feedback. Then she would play it well. And then I would go away and try to make it better before I came back the next week. So again, it's that practice, but with that feedback about what can be done better. Okay. Again, number 4 there is there to make sure, always think about the comprehension. So as appropriate, have some questions. And then number 5, decide if you want to read more text at that level or if it's time to move up to the next level. So it can be a decision between you and the student. Okay. Marn, question for you in the chat.
Yeah. Echo reading with a large group would be chaotic. And thank you for asking this, because ideally, if you're using echo, it should be with a small group of students, maybe up to 4. Number 1, that's less chaos when they're echoing. And number 2, you can better hear the individual reading in a small group.
And again, very labor intensive. So this is often where volunteers can be very helpful. So you can break into smaller groups or leveled groups so that you're not trying to have people at very different levels doing this activity. Because you're right, listening to everyone else is pretty confusing.
Yeah. So
and repeat. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And repeated reading is also very labor intensive. So having a tutor who can sit down and listen to the student read and provide that feedback and then practice with them is very valuable.
And the advantage of eventually reading paragraph by paragraph eliminates that students are just parroting what they've heard. So they can hang on to the phrase or sentence orally in their brain, and so they're just repeating what they've heard, and they aren't necessarily reading the words on the page. A comment about repeated reading. I have seen this routine used effectively, like in a computer lab, where students all have headphones and they've been assigned a leveled passage. And so they sit down, they know where to start, and they work quietly on their own, listening to and quietly rereading the text. And when they're ready, they can raise their hand and a teacher or student will come over and listen to them. I've also seen it used very effectively in a large group with iPads. Same thing, they've been assigned the appropriate level, they have headphones, and they are focused on their passage. In fact, that was amazing to me, considering all of the activity going on around at tables, that all of the students were very focused on their passage.
Ready to move on?
Yep.
Okay. So next strategy, again, probably familiar to you, choral reading, sometimes called duet reading, sometimes called partner reading, sometimes called neurological impress, but lots of names, all pretty much the same activity. You're reading aloud together, so you're providing that support for the student. So again, you're picking a text and you are picking an appropriate level text, something that's just a little bit above what they could read very comfortably. And then you as the teacher or tutor will read out loud at a normal rate of speed. And then the students will read aloud with you. And they may read, and if you're in a group, they may drop off, jump back in, jump back out. But you want to sort of pull them along a little bit so they're reading with you. You want to model good accuracy rate and prosody. Again, this is a place where it'd be horrible to have James Earl Jones lead the activity because nobody could possibly keep up with that. But you can keep up with Rob and the students can keep up with you. Okay. And then after you've done it once, go back and do it again, but you back off a little bit so the students are doing more of the work. Okay. And then the number 4 is you step back completely and let the students read on their own with you jumping in to help them out. Okay. And then again, number 5, always there, ask those 6W questions. Okay. This is one of those things that's really easy to do in a live setting or an in-person setting because everybody can be talking at the same time. It's a little bit wonkier via Zoom or on Google because if one person's talking, everybody can't be talking. So if I do this remotely, I'll generally have everybody turn on their cameras, but leave themselves muted. And then for the first pass, at least, I will be the one talking and I'm trusting that they're also reading out loud at home. Okay.
Yeah, this definitely has the potential for chaos. So if you're in the classroom, perhaps you can assign like group A, group B, group C. And so group A reads the first paragraph chorally with you while the others follow along. And then group B reads the second paragraph chorally. That would cut down on the chaos.
And again, it's another one where everyone needs to be fairly at the same level. So if a multi-level class, you're going to need to split it up and volunteers come in very handy. So you can have the lower level group and the intermediate level group all reading at the right level. I remember talking about this at a tutor training and a woman said, yep, this is just like choir. And I says, how's it like choir? She goes, oh, I get to choir practice a half hour early so I can stand next to the really good singer. Because when I'm standing next to the good singer, I'm a better singer. And when I'm trying to do it on my own, I'm not as good of a singer. So having somebody to hold on to and to keep up with is really valuable.
A challenge for me when I use choral is reading at the right pace for the student. Mm-hmm. So I will read a sentence or two and then say, how's the pace, to make sure that it's not too fast or not too slow for them.
Yeah, and you don't want to slow down too much because if it sounds like that, you're not really modeling fluent reading. So either stop and get an easier text, or if we really had our hearts set on figuring out what happened to the guy who never slept, I'll read it to them so that they have access to it. All right, Christine, next slide. And we're not going to model this just because we're virtual and all the sound cutting in and out would be crazy. And I want time for the next activity. So if you could flip to our last strategy, which is collaborative oral reading, which is simply a fancy term for taking turns. And so lots and lots and lots of different ways to do this logistically. So number one, you're going to pick a text or a book at the appropriate level or range. Again, those levels are really important. And then tutor or teacher is going to start by reading the title and then the first paragraphs or the first couple sentences, or just to get them started. And then you're going to call on somebody, and that student will take their turn reading a sentence or a paragraph or whatever amount. Okay. And then when they want to pass, they can pass, or when their allotted number of sentences is up, you'll have them pass. And they can either pass it to the person to the left, or they can popcorn to somebody. Again, it's a logistical concern to think about. Only the teacher, again, is providing those corrections. You don't want other students correcting each other. Okay. Again, multiple times of reading is great. You can switch who reads which sentences, so you get that extra practice. But I like Marn's underline, not with books. So don't read the same book over and over again. That gets a little bit of overkill. And then number 6, you're asking those 6 W questions. Again, remembering that comprehension is really important. And for this one, I would like to practice. So if I could get 3 volunteers to just type in the chat that you will volunteer. See if anyone's awake out there.
By the way, collaborative is a wonderful way to read books with students. So many times they've never started and finished the book. So doing it together is a way to get them from the beginning to an end of the book, and stopping to check comprehension along the way. Providing feedback is very, very guided, and offering frequent modeling also helps.
We got Keith, so we love Keith. Who's going to share the glory with Keith? So easy to avoid eye contact. So Grayla, great. And who else? One more.
Danielle.
Danielle.
And Carrie, if you
Carrie,
want.
Missed your turn, Carrie. You gotta go fast. All right. So I'm going to read the first paragraph, and then I'm going to call on either Keith, Grayla, or Danielle, who will read the next paragraph. And then that person will call on whichever 2 I haven't read yet. And then that person will call on the last person. All right, so I'm going to start. Places in space. Space is an exciting place. Our solar system is in space. It is made up of the sun and the 8 planets that travel around the sun. Our solar system also has moons, stars, and other space objects. So I'm going to call on Grayla. Could you unmute and read the next? There you go.
In the center. The sun is at the center of our solar system. The sun is a hot, bright star. A star is a ball of hot gas. It gives off heat and light. The sun is the star closest to the earth. That is why it looks different from other stars. Most stars look tiny and can be seen only at night because they are so far away. Keith.
Okay. Around the sun. A planet is a large ball made of rock or gas. 8 planets make up our solar system. You live on one of them, Earth. The others are Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Each planet moves in a path around the sun. The path is called an orbit. All right. Is it, who's left? Grayla?
Oh,
Danielle.
Danielle, sorry. No.
Around Earth. Earth has one moon. It travels in an orbit around Earth. The moon is made of rock. It is covered with deep holes called craters. The moon may look as though it gives off light, but it does not. It looks bright when it reflects light from the sun.
All right, thank you very much, volunteers. So pretty straightforward. You know, in real life, if you've done this, you know the logistics of students taking turns can sometimes be a nightmare. So if ideally they can popcorn around, you can go around in order, you can number the paragraphs and tell the students what number they're going to read. I've seen teachers who have identified the text by highlighting it or underlining it or bold it and then say, Keith, you're going to read all the bolded text or whatever. So whatever works logistically is great. And then again, if you can switch roles and go through it again or have other students in the group read, then you get that extra practice.
It's also interesting to hear the different voices.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I've observed this in classes, rarely do they call on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't always know each other's names. So it tends to be around the circle, around a table or around students sitting in chairs.
And the danger there is that students are reading ahead and then rehearsing in their head what their passage is going to be. But you know, there are worse battles to pick. The other way to do it is that every other turn can come back to you. So student can read, pass it back to you, then you pass it to a student. So that way they hear more fluent reading and it's a little way of controlling the logistics a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I recommend that the teacher reads after every paragraph or section or after a couple. And it gives the students kind of a breather too, because then they can just sit back and listen to the teacher.
Yep, and Christine had a point about popcorn type reading. You know, research shows it's terrible for comprehension, and sometimes people know that research, but it also shows that it's great for fluency. So again, remember that we're working on the fluency component here.
Except that the difference between a collaborative oral reading and a popcorn is that the teacher is there with them.
Right on the support.
She's modeling, and she's providing that important correction as needed. I selected this passage because it was about space and stars, but also it just is a really clear example of who reads what. So if it's multiple paragraphs, some are short, some are long, whereas these are all about the same length.
Next slide.
So I hope I can open this up. Nope, Christine, guess you'll have to do everything. So this is a chart, like I mentioned at the beginning, that was created by STAR teachers from the cohort 19. Took us until 21 to finish the cohort. It's set up by the 4 components. So looking at fluency, there are so many free websites. You're probably familiar with most of these. Still free, but you need to sign up. There's also materials that you can purchase. And then there's also a list of sources of books, either that are set up by paragraphs, like 6-way paragraphs, or they are actual books, where if your program can afford to, you can order multiple copies so that students can read books together with you in the classroom. So the book, if you could scroll down again, Christine. So the book companies are High Noon and Townsend Press, and they both have a wide variety of text types, levels, subjects. Townsend Press more than High Noon, but there's a lot of good books for students to read from those 2 companies.
And the novels, if I remember correctly, are relatively inexpensive.
Remember, they started out for $1 a piece.
Yeah.
And then as the years went on, it went up to $2. But for $10, you can get 5 copies of the same book. And so.
Yeah, we
depending
did, my group did the narrative of Frederick Douglass, and it was the Townsend Press abridged. And they got to keep it when we were done, which was pretty exciting for them.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of biographies. There's a lot of adventure books. There's, I would say, more on the nonfiction side, but maybe I just wasn't looking at the fiction. So yeah, those two have been over the years a great source. And a lot of them are repeated under comprehension because of course we're looking at texts for both fluency and comprehension. All right, quick final chat. If you could take a few moments before we close to share what information, routines, or resources will be most useful for you as you contemplate continuing or including fluency in your reading instruction. Okay. I like road tested. Yes. Researched and road tested, definitely. It's always good to know that you're doing something right. So that reinforcement is very important. Six-way paragraphs has been hugely popular across the years. Yeah, it's really a nice setup of passages and levels. Within one copy, there are like 5 different levels. So again, you're getting your greatest bang for the buck with 6-way paragraphs.
And you can get 6-way paragraphs in general, or you can get it in the content areas where the texts are split up by social studies, science, even mathematics.
Yeah, and the reason we present the 4 routines is that you need to pick what's going to work best with your students. And then when that one kind of wears out, you have something to switch to. Well, thank you, everybody. Oops, the question?
Yeah, Marn, this is Keith here. How much independent reading do you think low-level readers should be doing? Is it something you should suggest to students for reading at home?
I think sending home what's been practiced in class is the best idea for low-level readers, so that whatever they're reading at home is warm rather than cold. That would be my answer. Rob, Christine, do you have?
No, I'd agree. I'd agree.
Yeah, I would too.
Okay.
Sort of as the last pass at a text rather than the first pass at a text.
Yeah, because then they go home with something familiar and would be, I would think, more likely to read it because it has been warned.
I wondered if reading skills for today's adults was going to come up as a question.
I meant to mention it, that's what I was observing in the lab and with the iPads was students' use of reading skills for today's adults.
Yeah, I can address that. I think it's a great idea. I mean, it's certainly something that students can use to practice on their own, and then do maybe a practice reading for a volunteer or for the teacher, because they are separated into 3 speeds. The first speed being all about accuracy, the second speed being about starting to chunk into meaningful phrases and clauses. And then the final reading is normal speed, rate, and prosody. So I think I would have students listen and move up the speeds, but then eventually do a reading for me so that I could hear, they would practice, and then I could hear how they were doing with it.
Back in the day of cassette tapes, we had so many volunteers who would do books on tape of those books so that students could go home and read them. I'm not sure what the current technology equivalent is.